guys, to the Spurgeon Piper. This is Wilson with you. So a couple of notes on who Jordan Steffaniak is and why this interview or this topic. So on Jordan, Jordan is the president and co-founder with Brandon Askew of the London Lyceum, which began as a podcast, has grown to be quite a bit more, focusing on philosophy and theology from a various point of views on as far as who they host or who they have on in interviews, and both of them come from a Baptist confessional background, just like I do. Jordan's also the research fellow at the Center for Faith and Culture at the Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he's also a PhD candidate at the University of Birmingham in philosophy, hence why I wanted to have him on for this topic. So secondly, on this topic of analytic philosophy and theology, if you can already tell, it's going to be a more in-depth, complicated topic than I've had on just about anything else so far on the channel, but I think you're going to greatly benefit, just like I did, because Jordan and Brandon, they're both great at trying to be good thinkers, wrestling with topics that may bring in a lot of disagreement, but they want to stay not only holding to their own convictions, but be quite graceful to those they have on who they may have disagreements, and try to learn from them as well. Let's be better learners and better thinkers, and I think that goes well with the pipe hobby and the pipe lifestyle. So that's why I wanted him to have on this topic. I hope you are encouraged, and be sure to stay till the end, because there are some great nuggets of wisdom all throughout the podcast or the video. So hope you enjoy. All right, well, welcome back, guys, to the Spurgeon Piper. This is Wilson with you. So joining me today to talk about a topic I've been interested in for some time is Jordan Steffaniak. So Jordan, man, thanks for hopping on.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Analytic philosophy or theology, and I was trying to think when's the very first time I heard of it. I think reading something back, it may have been in college, it may have been afterwards. Yeah. It was tagged along with like Bertrand Russell possibly. And then later on, I think I saw William Lane Craig attached to it. Didn't think anything of it. Didn't even know what it meant other than just philosophy. And then years later, I started listening to you guys on the London Lyceum pretty much since the beginning, for whatever that's worth. And you guys identified yourselves as Baptist and confessional, got those, but then analytic. And I was like, I don't know what that meant. So since then, I may have understood it a bit more, but I wouldn't want to bet my life on it for sure. So again, that's why I wanted to have you on to talk about it. So let's start off. What is a definition or understanding of, we can just start off with analytic philosophy, since I think that's where it began in the first place.
Yeah. So, I mean, analytic philosophy by itself is just a school of philosophy that sort of, I mean, it has a certain mode of just going about how it tries to understand the world. So it's sort of like mode of intellectual inquiry is pretty logical. It's going to be full of sort of syllogisms. And by syllogism, I just mean you're listing out your argument. So instead of trying to like put everything in just paragraph form or put it in narrative form, it's analytic philosophy is sometimes allergic to narrative sort of styled arguments. It's going to say, okay, what is my argument? Let's see here. My premise is this: if this, then this. And then I'm going to do my next segment of the argument: if this, then this. Therefore, this is the conclusion. So it seeks to be very clear about what it's arguing for. Now, analytic philosophy, if you study it, if you look at it, I mean, it's gone through sort of a significant change over, I don't know, since the 50s, where for a long time, early on when it first started, it was sort of embroiled in things like what's called logical positivism and other crazy stuff that Christians don't agree with. And then somewhere in the 50s, they realized, hey, that actually doesn't work. You can't really do philosophy or do anything with that sort of methodological program. And since then, it's shifted, and it really has a robust just way of inquiry, trying to understand the world, trying to understand metaphysics, trying to understand ethics. I mean, analytic philosophy is going to talk about pretty much every topic that you can imagine.
Gotcha.
And most philosophy departments today are more analytic in nature. And that's usually contrasted with what's called continental philosophy. And that's going to be people, if you're familiar with like Soren Kierkegaard and others who are like that, who are very much more existential focused, interested in their feelings, interested in sort of like just exploring notions of just experience,
Okay.
which analytic philosophy is not like opposed to talking about those things. It's just the way it thinks, the way it goes about its method of inquiry is going to be very different than that. So for me, when I talk about analytic philosophy in service of analytic theology, it's just using the different sort of tools, different ways of understanding the world that analytic philosophy is used in service of theology. So I guess let me think of an example. I wrote a paper on multi-site churches, and I tried to say multi-site churches can't exist. And you can make a theological argument for that, but what I tried to do is say let's do something different. Let's use a tool of analytic philosophy called group theory, and that's just what is a group? How should we think about them? What counts as a group? Is it me and my coffee mug and myself? Like, are we groups? Is that a group of things or is that not? And so there's this whole discipline that tries to think about what is a group. And I tried to apply that to just understanding what is a church, what is the church. And so I'm using these tools here saying, look, this is what group theory says. And I think on group theory, this is sort of the options that you would have. And based upon what I think scripture says, you have to pick this model. And if you pick this model, I don't think you can have a multi-site church. So I think it's ways to assist theology. It's not like the end all be all. It's not like everything you do has to use analytic philosophy. It's just, this is another tool. If you're into like medieval, philosophy, or if you're into even the patristic era, you look at the patristic era, they utilized a lot of Greek philosophy. The medieval era, you're using a lot of Aristotle. And that's pretty much what this is doing. It's not saying this is the only thing we can believe or the only thing we can use. It's just, this is another tool to help us sharpen ourselves and understand how to do theology well. So that's a long answer to
but that's helpful.
Question.
And one thing that was going through my mind, just curious, would Kant be considered analytic or just uses analytic?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kant is confusing though. So I think a lot of, analytic philosophy, while it's hard, I don't think anyone would come in and say, look, this is an easy read. This isn't something that you read before bed. It's supposed to be clear. So that's one of the penchants. When people ask me what an analytic theology specifically is, I say there's two conditions that I like to think of as analytic theology. Number one is just clarity. So it's being honest about your argument, being upfront with the challenges that it encounters, and being willing to submit itself to critique. But then there's that second point of, it's usually going to use analytic philosophy in various ways to help discern and understand different sort of puzzles that we see in theology, whether it's the Trinity or the person of Christ, the hypostatic union, trying to understand how do we think about those things? Well, let's use contemporary accounts of, if it comes to like the Trinity or divine simplicity or something, contemporary accounts of what's called Mariology, which is the study of parts and wholes, using just different things like that to try to analyze and think through the different problems that you encounter. So clarity is supposed to be one of the like hallmark virtues of what it is. So in that, I think Kant significantly fails, but he's definitely part of the analytic tradition.
Gotcha. So you already started going this way, but that was more philosophy. Now, Christian theology, what are we borrowing from analytic philosophy to use in Christian theology?
So analytic theology is not borrowing necessarily any one actual thought. So it's not saying what analytic philosophy says here is true, and we all agree with this. And
that's probably helpful to make that distinction.
So and it's important to also know that analytic philosophy itself is, you've got 100 different views in there. So you could take any topic and you've got 15 different accounts of it, and no one agrees with each other. They're all debating it and trying to understand what's going. You talk about things like metaphysics or epistemology or these different areas in philosophy. When you say, what's the analytic philosophy sort of view on that? Well, there isn't one. it's an approach to how you think and do philosophy. It's not necessarily like a set core of beliefs.
Okay.
So if people want to say, I don't like analytic philosophy or I don't like analytic theology, I'll say, like, well, what do you mean by that? Why? Well, I don't like X doctrine. Well, then you clearly don't understand analytic philosophy or theology, because it's not a set doctrine. That's like somebody coming in to me and saying, I don't like systematic theology. Okay, what do you not like about it? Well, I don't like X doctrine. Well, that's kind of not the point. Systematic theology is just like what you're doing. It's not necessarily like tying you to one specific doctrine. There's 10 different approaches to systematic theology. You have Arminians who are doing systematic theology, you have Calvinists who are doing systematic theology. You got a bunch of different people doing
Right.
the same sort of thing. So it's just a way of doing philosophy and doing theology.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Um, and what you're getting at, you mentioned the various ways it can be used in approaches with either Lutheran, Arminian theology, Reformed theology.
Yeah.
So though we say analytic theology, it's not something that's distinct and opposed to those.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of people doing analytic theology. You have
Yeah.
open theists who do analytic theology. You have Reformed thinkers who do analytic theology. You have I mean, every person, just like in systematic theology, you have liberal people, conservative people, and everybody in
Right.
between. It's the same thing with analytic theology. Now,
Yeah.
there may be people who are more popular doing it than others, and then therefore it gets attached to certain viewpoints. But that's not like, it's not beholden to one aspect of it. Even though analytic theology as a term is relatively new, I think it was coined in like the 90s with basically within a book, an edited book by Oliver Crisp and Michael Ray. I think those are the two on it, and it was just sort of like introduction to it's basically just philosophical theology. At the point, it was the terminology that used to be used, and then they started applying this terminology of analytic theology because they were using a lot of analytic philosophy. And so I guess the first wave of thinkers who they would classify as doing true analytic theology would be people like Alvin Plantinga, Nick Wolterstorff, and others, Richard Swinburne, if you're familiar with those names. And then you have like sort of a second wave of people like Oliver Crisp and others who are sort of the big names in that area. And now I guess the big practitioners, I mean, Oliver's still doing stuff, and so is even Richard Swinburne. But there's others like Tom McCall who
That's what I
are
thought
well
of.
known. Yeah,
Now they're the ones that are most recent, and that was going to be the other question: is when did it begin? But I suppose, kind of with the analytic philosophy, maybe the category began giving it a title in recent history, but we find it throughout history.
Yeah. So I
in the
mean,
church.
really, I think most people, including myself, would just say analytic theology is just a contemporary version of scholasticism. So the scholastic method was just a method that was developed in the schools during the medieval period and on through the Protestant Reformation and onward. And scholasticism is not like a set doctrine. Again, this whole thing, it's a method, not like a doctrine.
Yeah.
So scholasticism is a methodology of just how you approach theology. It's just very organized. It's very methodical. It's going to ask questions of every possible aspect of things. It's going to try to give you every possible answer. It's going to try to reply to all these objections. And that's all analytic theology is doing. So it's really just a contemporary version of scholasticism, reviving it and infusing it with some of the new contemporary philosophical tools that are in the current debate. So I think that's really all it is. It's just
Sure.
a refreshed version of Reformed or even medieval scholasticism.
And I guess two names that maybe some would be familiar with would be one like Francis Turretin on more of the Protestant side, scholastic, and then the he who shall not be named, Aquinas. He would be very similar in that kind of line of thinking.
I mean, anybody you read in that period, medieval or pretty much after you get out of that very first wave of Reformed theology, everybody's doing theology in a scholastic method because you have to.
Right.
If you want to communicate and engage other people, you have to work in that mode. So while you look at Calvin, somebody like him, and you wouldn't really categorize him as using primarily a scholastic method. That's just partly just because of the context of the Protestant Reformation. It's far more polemical at that point. And once it becomes more established and has its own schools, you see Turretin in Geneva functioning in the scholastic method, using the scholastic method to defend Reformed theology. And you see that onward.
Yeah, yeah. So for some, maybe this still sounds very ethereal, and it's hard to put down in more simpler terms. What would be an example of using it? So if we were going to take a topic, a doctrine, what have you, how would it play out, and how would we approach it?
So analytic theology is not easy. So I don't want to tell you that, like, hey, if you just know A, B, and C, you'll know everything that goes on in analytic theology. You won't. It is hard. It requires a good amount of philosophical background to really grasp a lot of the stuff that goes on, because it assumes a lot of knowledge. It assumes an understanding of all sorts of metaphysical things. Now, it tries to define them and explain them. But if you really want to understand the nuances of things, you really need to do a lot of reading. So I don't want to sort of be a used car salesman and pretend it's easy.
Sure.
It's not. However, I do think the work in it is worth the payoff. So I'll give an example for, let's say, you're a local church pastor of some sort, or even just let's just start with the pastor. Oftentimes, one of the biggest challenges is creating sermons that land with your people and they understand what you're saying and communicating in clear ways. Analytic theology develops that skill of being clear in what you're saying and laying it out in a way that everybody can understand and examine and see, oh, I see where you're going with this. I see your main point. I see the ways you're supporting your argument. So I think it develops sort of skills that can transfer to preaching really well. But it also, a lot of the most high-powered theology today is being done by analytic theologians. So if you want to keep up with the debates and all the nuances that go on with the sort of doctrines that fuel the church's worship, you should be engaged in those conversations and know it. Scholastic method can look intimidating, but once you start reading people like Francis Turretin, you realize, wow, there's a lot of great material in here. Sometimes it requires you to read it a couple times, but it's the payoff is ultimately worth it.
Yeah, certainly. And I do like how you just connected it to worship, because it does come off as something that's more of an intellectual exercise, which obviously it is in many aspects. But I think of Anselm saying it's faith seeking understanding. Wasn't talking about necessarily analytic philosophy or theology per se, but the idea of where our faith will use philosophical methods or terms or to logical terms to seek a better understanding. You mentioned earlier how in the patristics we can think of Nicaea, where how do we defend the oneness of God and in the consubstantiality of Christ with the Father and Spirit, and then we start getting terminology like homoousios or homoousios.
And so those guys are pastors. And they're working with these difficult philosophical concepts and hammering it out over years and trying to understand and debate and think through it. So, it's something that the church has always done. It's just, I don't know, for whatever reason in our American culture, there's like sort of a negative reaction towards difficult, more academic sounding theology. So there's almost like an implicit bias that we have to overcome and say, you know what, knowledge is, yes, knowledge can puff up. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that knowledge is bad and we should avoid it and we shouldn't pursue it or something like that. It's not you just have to be very careful in how you approach things. You have to have the proper posture. You have to, continually, what I tell people, I think any theologian that's not praying, any theologian that's not reading their Bible, any theologian that's not, involved in a local church that's worshiping. The regular rhythm of that Sunday shapes the theologian and gives that nature. When you lose that piece, I think things start to fall apart.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I don't know. Those are some of my thoughts. That's what I can think of as far as like helping the worry that academics can become like esoteric and just completely abstract and untethered from reality to the all the issues that actually go on in people's lives. I think those sort of things, if you're doing those things, the proper posture should be naturally built into you,
Mm,
so that it's not, we shouldn't be constantly worried and checking over our shoulder. Do I know too much?
mm.
It is, we shouldn't be thinking like, let me tone down my knowledge in order to avoid being puffed up. No, we should make sure, let's make sure that we turn up our reliance on the Spirit. We turn up our other things. We shouldn't be dialing something down that's a virtue. Knowledge is a virtue. It's just we don't want to lose out on all the other aspects, that when we
Yes.
lose them, then we become a puffed up jerk.
Well, and you and I know that there's quite a bit of prideful ignorance as well out there. It's not something that just spurs up or bubbles up with more intellect or intelligence, and
Yeah.
so it gets to the heart of the sin, um, basically. Now, as you said, it's a deep topic. It's not necessarily easy, but if someone's like, "Man, this is stuff that's up my alley," I'm really interested. What are some entry level books or even articles that they can look into?
Yeah, I mean, so I always tell everybody, start with Tom McCall's Invitation to Analytic Christian Theology. It's I think it's with IVP, and I think it does a great job of sort of introducing what is analytic theology and just giving some examples. So it's affordable. There's quite a few other introductions to analytic theology that I like, but they're like $100 from Brill. So no one can afford that. I get it. Go read Tom's book to start, because I think that's going to give you sort of the resources, the tools, the conceptual ideas of what's going on, how it functions, and give you sort of like, I think he walks through like several examples of, let me try to put this to use in understanding like racial sin and some other things to kind of give you an idea of what's going on there. Besides that, I mean, if you're into journals, there's some top journals. Now, the thing about journals, they publish all sorts of things. So there could be trash articles in here. So don't hold me accountable for this. But for the most part, doctrinally trash. I mean, usually they're going to do it like they're going to try to approach it with a rigorous method that I appreciate. But sometimes, I mean, you've got, so like Faith and Philosophy, I think is a tremendous journal. It really started, what did it start, like 1970s with Alvin Plantinga,
Mm,
who's like sort of the godfather of analytic theology in a lot of ways. And I think it usually has just really excellent essays. Not now, most of the essays half the essays I probably don't agree with, but I learn from them, and I think they're useful and worth engaging and worth thinking about. Some of them are better than others, but I mean, that's just kind of how journals go. Some stuff is good, some stuff's bad. It's just
yeah.
you get submissions, and if it's a quality submission worthy of being published, then it gets in there, even if people disagree with it. Other journals, though, there is a journal dedicated to analytic theology called the Journal of Analytic Theology. Um, Over the last, I don't know, year or two, I feel like it's gotten weirder and weirder. So some of the original ones, like issues, the first like 5 or 6 issues were really good. They had some really good essays in there, and some that I keep going back to. Like there's one by William Wood on analytic theology as sort of a way of life, and sort of, so he sort of walks through some of the benefits of analytic theology, what it looks like for the Christian life, and I think it's a fantastic essay. There are other cool essays in there about the nature of the church, the resurrection, the beatific vision, things like that that are still really good in quality, but they got some weird stuff lately. So just know that sometimes there's weird things in there, but on the whole, I think they've got a lot of good essays in there. There's other journals. As far as other books, sometimes it's best to start with actual analytic theology to kind of get your feet wet. I personally was really helped by Oliver Crisp's old book, Divinity and Humanity.
Hmm.
And I feel like that's an old book. Let me look. It's from Cambridge University Press, and Humanity. Yeah, there it is. Well, it's not even that expensive anymore. So it's $37, which I guess is not cheap totally, but it's
It's doable. It's not bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was published in 2007. And I was really impacted by this book. So this was really one of the first books that kind of taught me the value and sort of like the place of things like the creeds and the confessions as we think about theology.
Yeah.
So he did a really good job of sort of like explaining, like, sola scriptura means the scriptures, the sole norming norm of all theology. And then he kind of like placed, here's how we should think about creeds and things like it, where he explained, look, you can disagree with the creed, but you have to have an extremely good biblical reason to do so. Your default should be, this is probably right because the church for 2,000 years has affirmed this thing. So if you in your individual self think that that's wrong, that's okay, because that's what it means to have scripture as supreme. But
Right.
you have to have a really, really good overriding reason. And the way he sort of explained it really resonated with me and sort of it kind of helped things click. But he's also just got some fantastic essays in here just about the nature of Christ and what does it mean that when he became incarnate, what's Philippians 2 exactly say, where, he like sort of emptied himself. So he's trying to understand, like, what does that mean? Does it mean he gave up his divine attributes? Does it mean that he sort of like paused his divine attributes? And I think it's a really fantastic book. So I continue to go back to that volume. There's just riches all over the place in it. So I think that's a great example of analytic theology to start with, if you want to like really just kind of jump into the deep end and get engaged with it.
Cool. Awesome. Good stuff. So before we end, if you want to let folks know more about the London Lyceum, because it's worth others knowing. So tell them more about it.
Sure. Well, the fact that you listened from the beginning, that's a testament to you probably more than us.
Yeah.
So the London Lyceum, like it started as a podcast, and I still don't even know why we started the podcast, because everything in me was like, don't do this, don't be another one of those guys. And yet somehow,
because there's so many out there.
I know. And yet me and my friend Brandon Askew started one, and we were terrible at it to begin with. I mean, we'd have to record episodes multiple times. And there was a point where it was like, some of them I was like, I'm not doing this again. The quality sucks, but I'm not re-recording this because I'm tired of you being in my house and I need to go do other stuff. So because we actually did them physically together at that point in time. And it's since grown to, like, we do podcast interviews. We drop one every Wednesday, and it's on a range of issues. So we, like the three things you mentioned, analytic Baptist and confessional theology, we try to talk about all those things. So every week it could be something completely different. It could be related more to one than the other. And we do that, but we started a YouTube channel. We've got a website that we started, and we try to host essays on there. I really like to host sort of like series of essays where I get different people with different viewpoints to talk about one topic. Sometimes they disagree with each other, sometimes they don't. So we had like one on theonomy that that's all the rage apparently. So I had like 7 essays on theonomy where people are all like reading about it, trying to understand it. And then had stuff on like penal substitutionary atonement, Christian Platonism. Right now we've got one on Baptists and the state. So trying to think about Baptist and religious liberty. So I think it's a lot of fun. We try to do essays there. We do book reviews. We've got other ideas of things we'd like to do in the future. So it's a lot of fun. If you want to check it out, go to thelondonlyceum.com. All the links are there where you can find podcasts, you can find the YouTube, you can find obviously all their articles because they're hosted on the website. And you can take a look around there. I think it's a lot of fun. I just enjoy it. I think it benefits people because we're trying to stretch people's sort of thinking muscle. So me and Brandon, we were in a context that we're Baptists, and there's just that, I mentioned it before, there's sort of like this implicit bias toward thinking really hard. That's not practical. That makes you prideful like a Pharisee. That is just not really useful for the life of the local church. That's something that just, weirdo academics do. And we're trying to say, no. I think scripture teaches us that we should think really hard about stuff. I think the example of the church shows us that all these pastors and all these great thinkers, they thought really hard. And for me personally, it was finding and stumbling on this great, robust intellectual tradition that really kept me in the faith to begin with, because I realized, wow, It's not just all rainbows and fuzzy bunnies. There's actually substance here. Some of the greatest thinkers in the world's history are Christians, and they're pastors, and they're trying to think about stuff, and they're doing it at a really high level. And so we try to start it with just initially the idea of, hey, Baptist, it's okay to think, and you should think, and you should think really hard. And let's expose you to some of the richer side of theology, expose you to different ideas that you have never heard from. So we have different people we strongly disagree with on our podcast. I'm going to be interviewing a guy named Thomas Ord later this year. He's an open theist. He denies some central core tenets that I think are the core to Christianity, like creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Yeah, we're going to interview him because I want to hear directly from him. Explain to me what you believe and why you believe it. And let me ask you some questions about it, because I think oftentimes, at least in my context, what happens is we get to the point where it's secondhand knowledge of different people.
Right.
We know a lot about something that we disagree with, but we haven't actually heard from them directly. And it can help to hear from them directly to clear up some of those misconceptions and have tighter understanding of why we think they're wrong. And I think it just displays sort of the right sort of posture towards people. I think Matthew Bingham said recently on one of our episodes, which I really resonated with this. He said, I want to be hard on ideas, but soft on people. And that's sort of the mode that we want to do things, where we want to be really hard on people's ideas, but not on the people themselves. We want to be kind to them, love them, treat them with respect and honor.
That's good. Yeah, absolutely. I can't recommend the podcast enough. I think I have like 20 that I regularly listen to off and on, and it's one of the top. So I definitely encourage folks to listen to it. No matter your background, as Jordan said, it'll at least stretch your thinking and make sure you're not holding up straw men of different views and all that, which often happens when we do hear from our favorite authors or pastors or theologians talking about another idea, and that can often lead to issues. So yeah, that's really helpful. Well, Jordan, man, thanks for hopping on. It was real helpful. I'm glad we were able to touch on the topic.
Thanks for having me. It was a ton of fun.
Yeah, you bet. All right, guys. Until then, we'll talk to you soon.